Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're calling in from. My name is Adriana Muir, and I work here at the State Department as part of our larger Arctic team. We just recently finished a 2-year chairmanship of the Arctic Council. That's the international forum of the 8 Arctic nations and the indigenous groups of the region that collaborate on issues of sustainable development and environmental protection. As part of that recent chairmanship, we wanted to really try and use that bully pulpit and the international attention to try and increase global awareness of the Arctic. And as part of that, we wanted to increase the awareness here in the U.S. and the fact that the U.S. is an Arctic nation. So we had a large agenda of things we were going to do publicly, and part of that was this wonderful Fulbright Arctic initiative. So how fortunate we were that State Department's Fulbright program was going to be able to fund this during the time of our chairmanship. This program was one that was able to bring together scholars from around the Arctic to collaborate on interdisciplinary research, as well as pursue individual pursuits of research. And all of this not only fed into raising the awareness of the Arctic, but it, of course, then also furthered the scientific agenda of our chairmanship. And it was, of course, a success in its own right. At the conclusion of the program, conclusion of their 18 months or so, I was fortunate to be part of a roundtable here at State Department, where all of the scholars came and presented some of their work to those of us who work on Arctic policy. And I must say it was very impressive. Their work is not only extremely fascinating and interesting, but it really does have a lot of policy relevance. I think many of us who work on policy will definitely be able to take this forward, not only into the Arctic Council, but to other Arctic policy that we have to represent as the U.S. and international fora. But if you don't want to take my word for it, you don't have to. In just a few minutes, you're going to start hearing from the lead scholars and other scholars that participated in the program. And then you can judge for yourself. I think you'll agree when all is said and done. So we'll have a series of presentations, and we'd like to hold all questions until the end, if you don't mind. If you need something in the interim, though, please do use the chat box, and Jessica or myself or others will try and respond if we can. And if you have questions and they just start rolling in and you don't want to wait, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and then we'll, again, try and field them at the very end. So with that, I'd like to introduce the first presentation, and that's going to be led by the lead scholars. And that is Mike Sfriga of the Wilson Center and University of Alaska, and Ross Virginia of Dartmouth College. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Adriana. This is Ross Virginia. Let me share my screen here. And hopefully that's worked out. Mike Sfriga and I have the honor to be co-lead scholars for the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. And we had the opportunity during the week of the Arctic, during the U.S. chairmanship transition in Fairbanks, Alaska, to have a nice conversation with Dr. Martin Jeffries, who's the executive director of IARPC. And we had a great conversation around the need for collaboration across the Arctic and internationally, and the need for exploring and developing interdisciplinary research models that are relevant to the policy process. And so at the end of that conversation, Martin said, well, I think this would make a great IARPC webinar. And so we thank you, Martin, for following through and inviting us to share the Fulbright Arctic Initiative more broadly with the community. And we look forward to continued interactions with IARPC as we move into a new round of the Fulbright. So Mike and I are going to do sort of a tag team here. And what we're going to do is present an overview of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, a little bit on its history, the objectives of the program, a little bit about process, because I think it's important to understand how we worked to see how we achieve the outcomes that we will share also during the program. And then we want to be able to introduce, hopefully many of you are online to hear about the new round 2 of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. And the application process is open. So we're going to give you a little bit of content on that. And we have people from the State Department and IIE to present that information. And then finally, we'll open, after the scholars talk about their work, we'll open up for questions and answer, a little bit of dialogue. As Adriana mentioned, the Fulbright Arctic Initiative was really sort of born out of a whole set of initiatives anchored by the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And in thinking about how Fulbright might contribute to the State Department, but more broadly, the Arctic, international Arctic policy community, I think this quote delivered by Secretary of State Tillerson at the Arctic Council Ministerial in May captures much of what we think about and want to do. And that is address really welfare and living conditions of the residents of the North, of the people that see the Arctic as a homeland. We all recognize that the Arctic is an important strategic place now in the globe. And what does that mean? And what does that mean to various stakeholders? What science is needed to understand those relationships? And very importantly, we understand that the global environment is changing rapidly, and much of that is focused on the Arctic, and the Arctic is an accelerator of global change. So it's a very important time for new scholarship and new models of collaboration to be mobilized and used and to be evaluated for their effectiveness. So the Fulbright Arctic model is based on the traditional Fulbright model. Fulbright's been around for 70 plus years, and it's the State Department's premier international exchange program, built around bilateral exchange of scholars, practitioners, and students to improve international understanding. What's different about the Fulbright Arctic Initiative is that it's a multilateral approach. It involves all the Arctic nations. And these scholars are coming together to work in teams, and you'll hear about how that works. Teams involve multiple disciplines, so a whole new approach for understanding and communicating one's work is needed in that environment. It's also slightly different in the research is really meant to be applied to developing policy recommendations, and in that process share that work broadly with the public. So these are the components that we knit together to be the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. And as I think we move through the presentation, hopefully you'll see how we've tried to do this, and hopefully we can have a discussion about how this model might be useful for other groups and organizations trying to contribute to Arctic policy. Mike, anything else here?
I think that's it. We'll just transition to the next slide, okay. Ross, and I'll just take your narrative from there.
Okay, here we go. There you go.
So to follow up on Ross's introduction, we had a bit of a challenge. The challenge not just to meet the expectations of Fulbright and address what local and subnational and national, regional, international communities were going through in terms of change and conducting research that has a sense of urgency, but could not only be published, but also get it in the hands of decision makers. That was one challenge. The second was creating what Ross has described as the model. And the model, as we will discuss in a little bit, morphed almost until the end of the program. But really, this was 3 Fulbrights in one. The first layer of the Fulbright was the individual scholarship of a scholar who went on an exchange, had a research project, much like a very traditional Fulbright. But we also wanted teams, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but the ways in which individual scholars fit their research into a team approach for research that was policy relevant and was impacted not only by the co-lead scholars, but really by their colleagues and by the ever-emerging issues in communities throughout the North. So it was very much an iterative program from beginning to end. Sometimes we thought we were on the right track, and we were, but we enhanced that track as it was being laid. We had web-based collaborations going on monthly through programs that Ross and I and others led with guest speakers. And then we had seminars throughout the 18 months where we integrated and synthesized and reworked the framework, but also informed and influenced the research that was going on. Ross, anything to add to that?
That's great, Mike. Here's your next slide.
Thank you. So the Fulbright one was broken out, as you see here before you, 8 nations represented, 17 scholars, with Ross and I working with these scholars, with what seems like 12 disparate disciplines. And when you look at it on a screen or paper or talk about it, well, maybe it does look disparate, but in fact, you can have a studio artist inform, influence, work with a sociologist and an economist and an engineer and an anthropologist to address the very issues of the North. Because as we all know, The issues of the North are multidisciplinary, disciplines know no bounds with all the challenges and opportunities before us. So it really was a rich lens to look through in terms of different disciplinary approaches and how these disciplines worked together and came at the very issues they were looking at from very different perspectives and different solution sets. We broke the teams out into 3 thematic working groups, 4 focal areas as you see before us. Nothing new to anyone on this webinar. Water, energy, health, and infrastructure across the North is a challenge. And this went on over 18 months. And as Adriana pointed out, this was a complementary effort to the U.S. agenda. So we were mindful of the agenda set out by the U.S. and mindful of what communities needed and mindful of what researchers and scholars had in mind in terms of the individual research and how that would apply to in a group setting. Ross?
Thanks, Mike. Really sort of the formative moment really for the Fulbright Arctic Initiative was the first time that we got to meet one another, and we worked together for a full week. And we were hosted by Fulbright Canada, and we met in Iqaluit, Nunavut. And this turned out to be just an amazingly important part of our process. We had the opportunity to be in a northern community, and we had the opportunity as we were meeting one another to meet the community. We started with connecting by Skype with Ambassador David Balton and senior official Julie Gorley to get some sense of the international setting and need for the kinds of science, policy relevant science that we were about to undertake. But being in Nunavut, we got to interact with the community. With the premier, we met with the premier. We met with other local leaders. For me, one of the best moments was when we met with a small group of high school students who were trying to initiate a recycling program in the school. And they were wondering what we had to add to that and what we thought of their effort. And they were so enthusiastic from our encouragement to be engaged in these kinds of activities. So being in a community, thinking about the challenges that face communities in the North around our thematic groups, water, energy, et cetera, really grounded us in the reality of trying to develop research questions and teams and approaches that would be relevant to, in a short period of 18 months, contributing to policy and decisions and increased public awareness. So as we say, we came together, we came as a group of individuals, but really in 1 week in this very intensive experience, we formed the basis of our team approach. So in that process, we sort of developed some guidelines for our model or our way of interacting with one another. And so we spent a lot of time trying to think about the shared challenges facing communities across the Arctic. We were in the Canadian Arctic, but how are those issues playing out in the United States and Russia and Scandinavia? So we spent a lot of time bringing our international perspectives to that issue. We also focused on who are the consumers or users of this research. So who are the stakeholders that we want to reach? And once we identified stakeholders, that really helped us focus our research, our messaging, and our communication strategies for engaging with those stakeholders. And a big part of this whole process and program has really been to seek public engagement. And you'll see towards the end here some concrete ways that we did that. And then finally, we really began to think about right at the start, what do we mean by policy and what is a policy recommendation? And how do we make ourselves presentable and relevant to the policy process? And that was a very challenging debate and one that we had throughout the entire program. It was a central theme throughout. Mike, to you?
As Ross mentioned, we had just a tectonic shift in way of thinking during the Iqaluit meeting where we not only got to know each other, but the entire lens through which we viewed the program came out of Iqaluit, where we had Indigenous leaders and community members speak to us. And as we were thinking about our program, they influenced what we were thinking and how we framed it. We met for a second time in Oulu, Finland. Our Fulbright colleagues there hosted us in Oulu. It turned out to be more of a week of the Arctic kind of celebration, but also a community event where the community engaged with us on issues related from technology to university enhancements to research. and really they were very, very interested in the work of these scholars, but also the scholars were influenced by those presenting to us. And on your left, you'll see you'll see a setting where some of the presentations were given. And these were like midterm report outs where we were individually and as a group in terms of our work and what happened during the time there. We added another layer while we were in Oulu. We brought in not just community members and researchers and our Fulbright colleagues, but we brought in a small group of what we called mentors, those who had either worked in the Arctic for many, many years, or those who were administrators, research professors, a really rich group to come in with fresh eyes and work with the groups individually, not so much to critique what the groups were doing, but to inform what the groups were doing. And for each scholar, individually and as a team, talk about their research, where they were going with it, what the outcomes look like. And these were tested with these mentors. And I think perhaps Greg and other scholars later on can maybe tease this out a little bit more, but that really was a rich environment where it wasn't just the scholars or Mike and Ross, but we brought in other mentors that really in a midterm influenced again what was happening. So as you can tell, but from Ross and myself, our dialogue, this was very much an iterative process. It wasn't a fixed way of doing business, but it provided a framework that allowed flexibility, but also a sense of urgency. And of course, the team building was fantastic. So not only do we get a rich idea of what the culture and history of the Oulu region was all about, and that's on your right, but we were put through several team building exercises where no one likes them, especially when you have to get dressed up and stand out in the cold and the snow. But at the very end, it does build team, but also tests while you're going through not just the teamwork, but it tests what it is that you're actually doing in your work. There was this landscape connection to what we were doing. Very important to continue to remind ourselves about what we were doing, how we were doing it, and who we were doing it for. Ross?
This one's yours, Mike.
So sorry about that. I think I dropped off, but I think I'm back on. Can you hear me, Ross?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Okay, good. Thanks. Yep. Sorry about that. Yeah, well, that's telecom in the north. This next slide here is sharing our networks. This is just an example of the work, and really it is just a small example of the work and the outreach, the presentations done by this incredible group of 17 scholars. Aside from publications and running their own conference, the amount of outreach, the amount of programming, the amount of publications, the amount of community engagement, where they went, who they raised money for, in addition to the money received, who they raised money from and what that funded. They did a lot of on their own work in addition to the work being done in this framework that I think enriched what we were trying to do, but also was a two-way street. So if a scholar had a particular interest in a particular component of their Northern Discipline studies, then they went out and got their own, secured their own resources, or decided to have their own program or their own conference or their own forum. So again, this was very, very dynamic and something unlike we've seen before, at least in the Fulbright structure.
Thanks, Mike. The culmination, the third sort of group seminar, if you will, was held in Washington, D.C., and we labeled it Fulbright Arctic Week. And it was an amazingly packed week of all kinds of activities. The collaboration between the State Department and IIE and other partners that we had gained along the way was just amazing to pull this off. So we had a whole series of events that were spread across the week, and we'll talk a little bit about them. A full day of science at the National Academy of Science with just a stellar group of scientists and policy specialists and people just interested in the Arctic. Dr. Muir mentioned we had a policy dialogue at the State Department. We had a whole morning with the senior Arctic leadership from the State Department, crammed in a very tight, small room, drinking Dunkin' Donuts coffee, and very, very much a real policy setting where we had the opportunity to present our work and share our ideas and make recommendations and to really have a true dialogue there. It was perhaps the most amazing experience I've had in DC in a long time. We also did some outreach, and I'll talk about that in a second, but we were very engaged with the Smithsonian. And then we also had a policy dialogue hosted by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And that brought together many of the think tank leaders in Washington to become acquainted with our work. So we've mentioned that outreach and public engagement is a very important part of this program. And many of the seminars and monthly webinars that we have are focused on bringing in people to help us communicate more clearly and directly and anticipate how to share our work with different stakeholder audiences. We had the opportunity to spend a few hours on the floor of the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in the Oceans Hall. And we were hosted by the Arctic Center at the Smithsonian and Director Bill Fitzhugh. And also with us at that time was an amazing group of young people from Alaska, the Arctic Youth Ambassadors, who were sponsored by the State Department as well. So the Fulbright scholars were paired with youth ambassadors and located in different places around the museum. And it was an opportunity for families and groups to walk up and just, well, who are you and why are you here? And we could share our science and try to explain its relevance and share the excitement of being a Fulbright scholar and being connected with the State Department. And it was just incredible. We had a live Facebook broadcast of this entire event, and literally hundreds of people had an opportunity to make contact with this program and with the Arctic Youth Ambassadors at that time.
Ross, this is Jessica. I just want to let you know we're at about 20 minutes right now.
Okay, we're getting close. So Mike?
Yeah, so thanks, Ross. Noting the time, I will simply say that here at this final day of the week, we had a whole week of programs, as Ross noted, and the final report out at the National Academies, where all of our presentations, individual, team group, and policy recommendations were reported out. I think it was quite interesting, even to those that, even to all of us that were part of this process, about the evolution and sort of the maturity of the work. Not in terms of the content, but in terms of how it was woven together between individual research, team research, excuse me, and actually relevant, tangible, and shared policy recommendations to communities of all different levels. So that was really what we took away from the National Academy's work, is that the full report out. In the middle of your screen, you see Iddy, who is a graphic artist who did incredible work. So that as you walked into what you would think to be a traditional academic program, you really were hit with the dynamic of the North through an artist's lens. It studies many issues related to the North, but you can actually get up inside of that wonderful artistic tube and look at glaciers and the oceans. And so we tried to bring the visual components of the Arctic, the policy components of the Arctic, the cultural, social, economic, political components of the Arctic, the challenges and opportunities all together. And this one day that was reflective of the whole week, but at the Academies, this rich report out of all the work being done by the scholars. Ross, anything else?
No, that sounds great, Mike.
Okay. And I believe our final slide here is the culmination of our time. We did get to meet with the Secretary of State, Kerry, briefly, and talk about not only our work, but of course he was briefed on the work involved in supporting this from the very, very beginning, fully understood its complementary role to the Arctic chairmanship. But having a rich week where we not only came together as scholars, but also feeling very good about the work done, the framework built, the ability to change that framework as we went along, and then having the time to at least take a photo and visit with the Secretary of State was wonderful. But really, I think the best part of it all was to watch something from 1 month through 18 months transition and transform, so much so that we'll have another Fulbright here as a result of the very good work being done by the scholars.
Great, thanks, Mike. So this is a perfect segue into, hopefully many of you online are interested in or considering applying for the round 2 of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. And so we're very fortunate to have Steve Money and Susan Mundell here to sort of introduce that program. They're part of the key team that makes this all happen and keeps it running. And this is a very large community of support for the Fulbright. So why don't we turn it over to you folks.
Yeah, thanks, Ross, and hi, everyone. My name is Steve Money. I work at the State Department in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, which is responsible for sponsoring and administering the Fulbright program. And as Ross said, you know, Fulbright's now over 70 years old. It's 8,000 grants per year, but this Fulbright Arctic Initiative was a really special and unique program. And I think you've seen already from Ross and Mike the big impact and success of the program, and you're going to hear more from actual scholars who participated. But it was largely due to all of their work that a program that was really meant to be kind of a one-time complement to the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council is going to actually be renewed for a second round. And we're really happy to do that because I think that there is so much more to be explored in terms of Arctic science, resilience of Arctic communities, sustainable economies. You're going to hear more from my colleague Susan about the themes for the next round. And hopefully there's people out there listening who may be interested in participating, and we'll give you all the info on how you can do that. So I'll turn it over to Susan.
Thanks, Steve. I'm Susan Wendell. I'm Global Program Portfolio Manager for Fulbright Student and Scholar Programs here at IIE. IIE is a partner agency of the Department of State, and we implement the program on behalf of the State Department. So here's a brief overview. We're following the same model that we did for the first initiative. It will take place over the course of 18 months from spring 2018 to fall 2019, including 3 in-person seminar meetings, with the first opening meeting taking place in Canada in spring 2018. The midterm meeting will take place in one of the participating Scandinavian countries in winter 2019, and the final meeting in Washington, D.C. in fall of 2019. In addition, the individual research exchange visit will be between 6 to 12 weeks for independent research in one of the participating countries, which is Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and of course the US for participants in those countries. Along with our ongoing virtual collaboration, which under the guidance of our co-lead scholars, Mike and Ross. And the research themes for this year is resilient communities and sustainable economies. We've got more information on our website about the themes, and we'll be going into depth on these topics in a couple of later webinars that we're hosting on the details of the application. This is a brief overview of who's eligible to participate, and this is for scholars, professionals, and applied researchers from the participating countries. In addition, you must be a citizen of one of the participating countries and residing in the country of citizenship in order to participate. And again, we've got more information up on our website. So I'll move on to our deadline for submitting the applications. The applications are submitted all online. The deadline for international applicants is Monday, October 16th. And for US applicants, it's Monday, October 30th. If you are a international applicant, you need to contact the Fulbright Commission in your home country, or in the case of Russia, our IIE office in Moscow. And for more details, we'll be doing a very in-depth webinars that we're hosting on September 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern time, and then again in October. And this will be an opportunity to go into the nuts and bolts of the application process with opportunity to ask questions from our recruitment staff. You can register for these webinars at our website right up at the top, cies.org/Arctic. And you can also reach us if you have any questions about the application process. Send an email to arctic@iie.org. And our Twitter feed and Facebook are right there as well. Steve, did you want to add anything?
No, Susan, thanks for that. Just to say, anybody who's interested in applying, please go to the website for the full details. The email address that's up on the screen, arctic@iie.org. For any questions, those questions will go right to Susan, and I'm sure she's eager to answer them. And then those two webinars will be one in September, one in October. They'll also be recorded, and the video will be posted on the program website for people who can't make those, but may want to view them later. And now we'll hear from some great participating scholars from round one. I'll turn it back to Adriana.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to our first of the three scholars. We're going to hear from Gregory Taylor. He's a scholar who was part of the energy group. So he's going to speak to us today about the work of that group as well as his individual research that he did out of University of Saskatchewan. Over to you, Greg.
Greg, you're on mute.
Thanks.
There we go.
No, thanks very kindly, and thanks for the opportunity to share, for us scholars to share our experiences with you. And there's four main points I would like to leave with folks if you're considering the Fulbright Arctic Initiative Scholarship Program. And when you read the Fulbright literature, it's full of the raw stuff, as it should be, about how it'll be life-changing and it'll be professionally changing and all that stuff. But the funny thing is, it's actually true. And it's this is easily one of the most important life-shaping things I've ever been engaged in, both personally and professionally. And I have a huge amount of gratitude to the program for the kind of doors it opens. And Fulbright opens so many doors for scholars with other colleagues around the circumpolar north internationally, with government, with indigenous communities, industry, and so forth. There'll be doors open to you that you would never dream possible. And I have a profound and will have a lifelong gratitude to the Fulbright program for that. The other very neat thing about this Fulbright Arctic Initiative, because it's a little bit different in that you're not just looking at your own individual scholarship, although that's an important part of the program. You end up working in groups, and you end up working with groups of people, scholars you've never met with in your life, and that is such a different experience. Normally, when you put together a group research project, you're calling all colleagues that you've worked with or studied with and so on, and you're known quantities to one another. And this one literally is an arranged marriage. And I can assure you, arranged marriages can work. And this one certainly did. And in our group of folks on the screen that you can see, we had a web page, and you'll see from Bjarnimar Magnusson from Iceland. You had Gwen Holdman, the director of the Alaska Energy for Center and Power at UAF. Gunhild Hjorth from University of Tromsø. Myself, Laura Soka from Finland, and Maria Tsiashanuk from Russia, and Noor Johnson, also from the United States. And there's legal people, there's anthropologists, political scientists, engineers, the whole scope of folks. But as Mike and Ross pointed out, you really need that full scope of folks to be able to do the work we did. And one of the most rewarding things is when you go into a project like this, you don't want to be there just producing research that might get footnoted a couple of times or sit on a library shelf. You want something that's policy relevant, that you're actually engaged in applied policy research. And with the colleagues we had, we were very lucky. I had very gifted and committed colleagues to work with. And so some of the things that we did were, for example, reaching out in the social media world, and we had a series of blogs about different topics, including Gwen's there, who did her placement in Iceland right at the time Iceland was kicking up a storm in World Cup, and you have you have Gunhild from Norway, for example, Laura working on stuff from Finland. So we try to reach out that way. But the other thing that we produced that had, and it continues to have impact, is this report, and that's available online, and I can follow up and send links to it as well. And you can see all the scholars that were involved in putting that together. But when we look at things that are actually directly policy relevant, you can see that come out in the recommendations we worked on together in this report. Everything from addressing barriers. This was really, how do we build out renewable energy in Arctic and subarctic regions, focusing on energy access and energy security, which are so deadly important to northern communities. So we got local level renewable development. We're looking at things like capital, we're looking at research development, and a possibility for an export industry globally coming out of the north. These kind of recommendations have been worked with all 8 Arctic states governments. We're currently getting funding to expand on this initiative and do more work. And one of the concrete products that came out of this is this map. There had never been a map before in between University of Saskatchewan and University of Alaska Fairbanks, the world first, mapping out all the off-grid communities from the 8 Arctic states. And this has gone to the Department of Defense of the United States and to other governments as well, Canadian government in our case. Something that was a first. Never, absolutely, this would never have happened if it wasn't for the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. More locally, on an applied level, as a final example, we did a pre-feasibility study with a Northern Cree community in northern Saskatchewan, looking at the adoption of renewable energy resources to meet community energy needs. These are communities in which they're on electric heating, they don't have natural gas, and a community or a household income might be $20,000 a year, but their electrical bill might be as high as $800 or $1,000 a month. And for some of the poorest communities in our country and in the circumpolar region, these energy issues are huge. But because of Fulbright, we're able to work with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, working with folks at the U of S, working with Sask Power, and with Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation to do a pre-feasibility study of community renewable energy projects and deployment. And that looks like that's going to take shape over this next year. Again, this is taking high-level research, grounding it, getting steel into the ground, and having policy impact. So that's my story. I cannot strongly enough encourage people who are built this way and care about these things to apply. And you're going to be in hell of a good set of hands with Ross and Mike. We got here because of their leadership, and I can't thank them enough. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Greg. Thanks for sharing your experience promoting the program and showing us the great document that the Energy Group produced. We'll hold questions for Greg until later, but if you can't wait, please just put them in the chat box and we'll try and get to them at the end of all the presentations. Next, we're going to move on to Susan Chatwood. And Susan works with the Institute for Circumpolar Health Research, and is affiliated with both the University of Toronto and the University of Alberta. And she was a member of the Health and Infrastructure Group. Over to you, Susan.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to bring up my screen here. Let's see, oh, share screen. Okay. Sorry, I have, there, is everybody seeing it okay now?
You betcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
it looks good, but your video, I think, is off, Susan.
Okay, is that all right if I leave that off?
Yeah,
Because it'll, the bandwidth, I think, will go. Okay, yeah, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. And I'm just going to share a bit of information from the perspectives of the Health and Infrastructure group that came together. And the slide up now has the different people that were part of that group, and you can see by the affiliations, the disciplines we came from. including public health, urban development, energy, environmental work, or environmental studies. And we came together to look at, sorry, I'm trying to move my, oh, there. We came together to look at what are some of the shared challenges around health and wellness in Arctic communities. And it was quite interesting. Like Greg said, there was a number of us coming together who hadn't traditionally worked across disciplines. So one of the first things we realized is finding ways to talk about community wellness when you have an engineer sitting in a room, perhaps with a nurse practitioner background or public health or urban planning, and realized that we didn't really have very many interdisciplinary models where we could sort of jump into saying, you know, our first thought was sort of, well, what's going to be a shared research question here, or how do we begin to look at this? And we realized we're all talking different languages across disciplines and coming from different nations. And so a lot of our work within our group focused on looking at what are multidisciplinary approaches that we can enhance our understandings of community wellness and determinants of health in the Arctic, and realizing that, you know, community health isn't just about health of people, it's also determinants that are impacting health. For example, Greg was talking about, you know, access to energy and food security and climate change and environmental sciences, how that's interacting with health. So we wanted to, through our group activity, look at what is a more holistic model for Arctic health. And that's inclusive of disciplines and of communities, and are responsive to shared challenges in northern regions. And one of the first things, it was mentioned earlier, you know, there were artists involved, and we really had to bend our thinking about how we were looking at a question. And in terms of community engagement, one of the first pieces we did was brought together some community members, some youth in Greenland, who developed the logo for us. And I'm just going to show a quick 1 minute, 40-second video here that provides a bit of background for the logo, and also a bit of a story behind how we began to look at community wellness. Oops. And we're going to test the technology here.
Susan, we can't hear the video. Can you?
Oh, okay, you can't? Okay, very good. So I will go on to the next slide. So the video was a young person talking about the logo that was developed here and sort of the inspiration for that. And she talks a bit about the colors and the relationship to the environment in terms of the blue, the snow, the ice, and the green representing spring and the seasons, and then went into some of the traditional stories behind the symbol that was used. So and for us, that was going through that process. It just sort of, you know, put the collaboration and the interactions of all the factors in the environments and communities into a piece of art, and it was almost like a common language that we could use between all of us, and we use that as our logo going forward. But overall, through the year of interactions, and you saw the number of seminars and workshops that we either attended or hosted, a lot of our findings were around the process, and that you really need to think about your process and have, I guess, levers that enable you to come together and interact. And some of the activities we did were literature reviews and consensus seminars with community members. And what we found was, oops, my slide just moved here. Interdisciplinary collaboration is not prominent in the scientific journals. There's a lot of literature in the environmental sciences, sort of interactions with community Indigenous knowledge holders. But in general, when we looked at sort of engineering, working with public health and urban planning and sort of the work that we were beginning to do as Fulbright, there's not a lot in circumpolar regions. And so as multidisciplinary sciences, we need to learn new languages, so begin to understand each other's languages in addition to our own cultures and approaches to scientific inquiry. And through engagement with Indigenous knowledge holders and communities, recognition that storytelling is a holistic and scientifically based approach used to synthesize and share information in the Arctic. And we had some wonderful interactions through workshops and bringing in elders and community members that each of us currently work with within our own research programs, and just looking at how Indigenous knowledge interfaces with some of the interdisciplinary academic approaches was exciting, and we began sort of some initial understandings there. And as an approach, consensus workshops with Indigenous knowledge provided forums for engaging dialogue, and you could move quite quickly on some synthesis of priorities on determinants of Arctic community wellness. And one part I just want to take a couple slides and speak about is some of the community engagement. So with the circumpolar regions, Alaska, the territories in Canada, Greenland, and Sami regions within the Nordic countries, we were able to bring together both knowledge holders, people working in community sectors, be it health or urban planning, and talk to some of the people living in the regions about, what are some of the determinants of community wellness. And this word cloud captures some of the main findings. This was a seminar hosted at Dartmouth College, and there was more North American representation at this one. And just in terms of community perspectives, highlighting the need for training, capacity building, renewal of cultural connection, the impacts of the rapid transitions, environment, climate change. And you can see some of the other words there in terms of items that were raised. And that's important to acknowledge as we're looking at what is impacting community wellness. And we began to do work sort of backpedaling on some of these and exploring what that means in terms of our interdisciplinary connections.
Susan, this is Jessica. Just to let you know, we're running about 10 minutes behind.
Okay, very good. And so highlighting here some of the methodologies where for engaging communities that we're involved with, youth elder interactions, traditional knowledge, and how that the models for traditional knowledge is one of the interdisciplinary sciences. And this photo is from Dartmouth College from the workshop that we had there. And storytelling. And within our group, we did some digital stories and were able to engage partners and explore some of these determinants in more depth related to trauma, environmental changes, climate change, resource development, and the impacts these are having on the communities. And these videos are still under production. And then, at the end of it all, and we were really, it was great because you were always being pushed and, we did take a lot of time to think about the process, because I really want to emphasize that process is important, and because so often otherwise we just fall back into the comfort of our silos and our funding agencies and sort of how we're directed on the cogs of the machine that moves science forward. But you have to really think about how you push yourself outside of your discipline and interact with other disciplines. And so talking about policy, and mentioned the meeting in Washington at the end, and we were at the Glacier Science Forum in Alaska, and all of a sudden being in front of a policy maker and thinking, well, what would I say in an elevator right now about what's happening. And what we really wanted to emphasize is the importance of continuing to facilitate this opportunity for these connections across sectors, and then also to support mechanisms that enable community engagement. And in some of our jurisdictions, there isn't the academic infrastructure that we've had good engagement otherwise in a consistent way, advancing self-determination. And that can be, that's at many levels. It's not just government self-determination, but just that ability for people to be engaged and contributing in meaningful ways. Indigenous knowledge and how that's included in the science process. And there's been some agreements between the US and Canada and US and Norway, recognizing within Arctic science the importance of Indigenous knowledge. And we really need to advance our models, how we're doing this, and also have the science policy support for the engagement. And so hopefully some of the work we've done will have some lessons in how others can move this forward. So I'll end there, and only to say that the Fulbright, it was an opportunity where we're all able to get sort of pulled out of the places where we're usually moved, and it gave a bit more space for innovation in our science, and how we look at the Arctic. And it was a really wonderful experience to be able to learn from the other disciplines and begin to understand a bit of the other languages and how people approach science, and continue scholarship in the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. During your presentation, Steve and I couldn't help but just note how important that type of research is that you and your group performed, and how much policymakers really do need more information that comes from communities, and how the integration of traditional knowledge into science is really key. So thank you again. We're going to move on to our final speaker. The final speaker is Tamara Harms. She was part of the water team, and she's coming to us from University of Alaska Fairbanks. Over to you, Tamara.
Okay, thanks, Adriana.
Sorry,
Susan, you need to
Susan,
release your screen before I can share mine.
Yeah, Susan, you have to click stop share on the top. It's a red button.
So I'm speaking on behalf of the water group, and the water group was a interdisciplinary group consisting of myself, a freshwater and catchment scientist working at the University of Alaska, and several marine focused scholars. So Øystein Barth, based in Svalbard, a biological oceanographer, Eddie Neuhaus, a visual artist from the US, Niels Vestergaard, a resource economist from Denmark, and Tarn Anbam with the World Wildlife Fund in Sweden. And so because we were a team of freshwater scientists and several marine scientists, we tackled thinking about how we might make policy recommendations regarding resource use, subsistence, and environmental sustainability of the Arctic Ocean. And because the Arctic Ocean is experiencing myriad changes, both in drivers of economic and biological responses, changes in the amount of and cover of sea ice, changes in ocean currents, temperature, pH, as well as changes in biological and economic responses, we were confronted with a great deal of uncertainty. And so we took on the challenge of thinking about ways that we might reduce uncertainty regarding the Arctic Ocean. So we categorize these into two main groups. One way that we can cope with uncertainty is to use long-term monitoring to build models upon which we can forecast the future. And the second is to engage in a process of scenario analysis. So I'll highlight this idea of using historical data to forecast the future by way of an example. I did my individual exchange at Umeå University in Sweden, in northern Sweden. While I was there, I had the opportunity to visit the Abisko field station, an Arctic research station in Sweden that's sort of the sister field station to Tuluk Research Station, where I work here in Arctic Alaska. I spent most of my time on campus at Umeå, interacting with colleagues there, and had opportunity to travel to Stockholm to meet with my collaborators in Stockholm. And so the work that I was doing was focused on predicting changes in river discharge in the Arctic. So the Arctic Ocean, as most of you probably know, is the most land-influenced ocean. It's about 1% of global ocean volume, but receives over 10% of global runoff, so it's very freshwater influenced. Separate from the Arctic Ocean, rivers have importance in the Arctic as corridors for travel, both for industry and for subsistence, access to subsistence resources. And then there are sources of power in many regions. And so previous work has shown that river discharge of the largest Arctic rivers has increased over the period of record. That's work from Peterson and all studying the very large Arctic rivers of Russia. And so I wanted to ask whether we could predict or understand changes in discharge regimes in smaller rivers that are regionally or locally important. So I'll just show an example here. I applied a Fourier transform method to summarize the expected hydrograph for each of the rivers that I studied. And so the results of that analysis are shown here for the Chena River, which runs through Fairbanks here locally. The red line is the annual expected discharge, so discharge on the y-axis and time through the year on the x-axis. And each of those individual points is a measure of mean daily discharge. And so from this analysis, we can ask, well, how far off are some of these observations from the predicted or expected discharge pattern? And we call those anomalies. So we can sum up for each year all of the anomalies. So how far the river discharge record is varying from the expected discharge. And then we can ask, well, what's causing major flood events or major droughts in each of these rivers? And so for 5 rivers in Alaska, I asked about what influenced patterns in those discharge anomalies. There are 3 rivers shown in green that are precipitation and groundwater fed rivers, and then 2 in blue are in part glacially influenced. And so here I've asked about the potential drivers of those anomalies. On the x-axis are the effect of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and then the effect of annual precipitation in the middle, and on the right, the effect of mean annual temperature. And so each of these points is showing the strength of those drivers in predicting the discharge anomalies. And if the bar here crosses 0, it means that effect is not significant. If it doesn't, it is. And so the Pacific Decadal Oscillation had no influence on discharge anomalies in this set of rivers. But unsurprisingly, those precipitation and groundwater fed rivers are strongly influenced by precipitation. So in high precipitation years, we get high flow. So we can use weather forecasting and climate models then to predict river discharge in those types of rivers. But for the glacially influenced rivers, precipitation had a less strong or even non-significant influence. But instead, mean annual temperature tended to be a more strong predictor of discharge anomalies in glacially derived rivers. And so perhaps using the temperature predictions could provide some insight into predicting the future of river discharge there. So because using long-term data to forecast the future requires a long-term record, one of the policy recommendations of the water group is that we need an international commitment to long-term monitoring. So the analyses that I showed for Alaska, those 5 rivers, are the only rivers that I can carry out that analysis for in Alaska, because the certainty in our predictions is related to the length of our records. And most of these methods, these models, require fairly gapless records. And so we need to invest in a long-term monitoring program that maintains continuous records. It's the recommendation of the water group that we seek the participation of residents of the Arctic in these monitoring programs. They know where changes are occurring and should direct the locations of instrumentation or measurement programs to capture these changes, and they should be employed in gathering the data. And then finally, we need to strengthen our opportunities for exchange of information among residents who are observing these changes, scientists who are analyzing them, fishers and other groups that are extracting and using resources, and connect those observations and the output of these models with policymakers. So we can use the past to predict the future when we can have a constrained problem that we can model. But because the Arctic Ocean is being confronted by simultaneous changes in multiple drivers, that becomes a very difficult problem to model. And a way that we can cope with uncertainty in multiple dimensions of a system and examine simultaneous changes in multiple drivers is to engage in a scenario analysis endeavor. And so here we can envision multiple potential futures that we maybe can't model at present, but with expertise from multiple sectors, we can put together these scenarios. So here's an example of one set of scenarios that we have suggested. This set of scenarios is focused on forecasting the effects of changes in international governance of the Arctic Ocean and economics. And we, along those axes, then can envision potential future states of the Arctic Ocean that range from a strongly governed eco-preserve where there's very little resource extraction to a very weakly governed system where there's just an open access rush in of new extraction of resources. And so we've recommended that this scenario analysis approach is a way to cope with uncertainty in multiple aspects of the system. So my concluding point is that as a basic researcher, the Fulbright Arctic program allowed me to have a view into the policy process that I hadn't had before, as well as begin to think about connecting my work to local communities. So we met with so many members of diverse communities. This is a really unique opportunity for me to think about how my basic science connects with and how I can use it to better address the challenges and concerns of local communities. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamara. That was excellent. And I'm really glad you showed us that graph because now I feel like I actually did learn something today. Take that away. And thanks for your reflections on your time in the program and for being brief. Now we still have some time for Q&A. Jessica, let me know how you want to run this. We have 2 questions in the chat box that I can go ahead and put out. If other people can go ahead and put them in, I think we welcome that. And we can also take some over the phone, perhaps, if time allows.
Since we have a few, yeah, go ahead with the ones that have already been entered, and I encourage everyone to enter their questions into the chat.
Okay.
I could also unmute everybody, but that has the potential to be disastrous. So I'll encourage everybody to just enter it into the chat.
We have 2 questions, and Ross and Mike, these are both for you. The first question is in reference to your presentation where you noted that there was identification of the consumers or the stakeholders of the research. If you could give us a little bit more information on what you mean by that, and in particular, who was ultimately identified in that process? If I'm paraphrasing the question correctly from the person who sent it in.
Sure. Well, this is Ross. I think, right from the beginning, the close connection between the Arctic Chairmanship Program and the Arctic Council meant that was an important for us to understand the Arctic Council and its needs and the function and structure of working groups. So that was very relevant to consider the Arctic Council as maybe the highest level stakeholder or consumer user of information and research coming from the Fulbright Arctic. But we also considered how to look at communities. And you've heard the application of our work in terms of health and energy and water resources and impact on communities. And I think each of the working group came up with a different set of stakeholders based on their disciplines, their personal connections. I think one of the major outcomes of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative was that each researcher came with a network, and we built a network of those networks. And so I think that when we think of stakeholders, I'm really thinking of more broadly, how do these networks span out and move out from the collaborative energies of the various Fulbright researchers.
While we have you on the line, the next question for you and/or Mike. In concrete terms, can you please tell us how the first Fulbright Arctic Initiative is going to inform the second Fulbright Arctic Initiative?
Mike, you want that one?
I'll address that one first, and then Ross, jump in, please. But back to the first question again, Ross, I think nailed it, is that we had a network of networks. We were all very much engaged in communities throughout the North. And so the stakeholder range was quite broad, which was part of our challenge. Arctic Council, subnational level decision makers, all the way to local communities and the challenges that they had at the local level. So if it was coastal erosion, we were informed by the scholar and their network about the very issues that they were hearing from local communities, in this example, coastal communities. So this network of networks was powerful. We didn't have the time to visit, of course, all the places we were doing work in, but the scholars brought their networks. We were able to add to those networks. And then the monthly seminars that we held via the web, and the 3 meetings that we had throughout the 18 months also included stakeholders from a variety of areas that informed what we were doing. So the stakeholder range was pretty broad and pretty challenging. For the second, the framework for the first program certainly influenced the second framework. We had 4 broad areas. You can see now there are 2 thematic areas. We see these 2 groups working together within the group, but then across these 2 different areas as well. So the first one was sort of the test bed for this second one. We liked the framework because of the issues we were addressing in the first Fulbright, but then we thought about ways in which we could make this a bit more manageable, but also morph the ideas into what we were hearing as a result of what happened during the first Fulbright. So the 2 themes you see before you for the Fulbright Arctic Initiative 2 is a result of the work done by the scholars in the first Fulbright, but also the input we had from the people we presented to, from feedback on papers written. So it was very iterative, considered what it is that we accomplished, considered what the next steps were, and really how to take this from what you just heard to perhaps a more focused thematic approach that allowed us to apply the first set of frameworks and the first results to a second. So these 2, there's a big bridge between the 2 of these. And I'm happy to say that some of the Fulbright scholars will help us in this second Fulbright as well. So there's a direct link between the 2. Ross, did I cover everything?
Yeah, and just to add, for example, one of the plans is to have some of the first round scholars join us in our inaugural meeting for round 2 in Chatwood or in northern location, to sort of share their experience and be mentors in the startup process. And the scholars from the first round are all collaborating, working together, writing grants. Their research just keeps going and going. So we're going to expand the network from Fulbright 1 into Fulbright 2, and we're going to be encouraging all of the inaugural scholars to be mentors and collaborators, and to make this bigger and better. And so they're directly connected in just the right ways.
Great, thank you both. So we have one more question that's come in through the chat box. Are there research funds and a stipend associated with a successful Fulbright application? I think this one is basically for State Department. So I'll defer to my colleague here, Steve, as well as Susan, who I know we also have still on the line with us.
Yeah. Yes, the Fulbright scholarship, if applicants are successful and are selected as part of the group, does come with research funds and a stipend that covers participation in the program. The full details of that are on the program website. So I'd encourage potential applicants to check out the benefits and other aspects of the program on the website.
Anything to add, Susan?
Yeah, I would just add to that, saying that the funding that you get from the Fulbright really leverages your ability to do those interactions that the opportunity has created. But it's also helpful if you're able to bring in your existing research as a scholar, like build from your individual project and perhaps grants that you hold already. Now within the group, there were people that had existing research programs. There were others who didn't. So it's not to say that one or the other is better. But I think it was helpful within the cohort that there were a few people who had some grants which had already been successful, and there was that funding in place. Now moving forward, there's some of us who are collaborating and we're continuing to write grants. So some of the programs that I've established, like now have, new partners or a new direction or that type of thing. So it's a little bit fluid how that moves back and forth, but perhaps the co-leads would want to comment a bit more on that.
Greg here, I might just throw in the Fulbright. Definitely, as Steve pointed out, you do get a stipend with us, which is invaluable to participate. But we, in our group, not dissimilar to Susan's, probably leveraged 2 to 3 times easily the money because it was Fulbright. So you say you have a Fulbright, we want to do more work. And the cachet of Fulbright leverages up 2 to 3 times that money right there. So the multiplier effect is huge. The other thing, as Susan's pointed out, it continues on. At the beginning of September, we're going to be having a workshop and putting together a symposium workshop where we're bringing together Indigenous organizations from Alaska, Northern Canada, and so on, as well as some of the Fulbright Arctic energy team from Finland, Norway, etc., and Alaska. And the funding that we have because of Fulbright, we've leveraged that in. So we got your stipend, I think last time, I forget how much money it was in total, but it was SASPAR alone, 100,000, another 25,000 from Canada's equivalent of NSF. We also have funding from the US government again, from the United States Embassy in Canada. All of that is all because of Fulbright, to be brutally honest. So the leveraging opportunities are phenomenal.
Thanks, everyone, and definitely money begets money. That is for sure. There's a request that's just come in. This is for Susan. If you're able to please share with everyone the link to the video for which you tried to play, but there was no audio. I think people would appreciate that. Either putting it in the chat box, sharing that with everyone, or maybe sending it off to Jessica and she can make sure that people can get it.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
Questions?
So I'm able to unmute everybody if anybody wants to ask a question via audio, but we have no more questions in the chat box right now. Oh, wait, one just came in. Oh. This one just came into me privately, so I will post it in the public chat box, and Adriana, maybe you can moderate that. Oops. There.
And the link has just come through, everyone, to the video. If you're interested, find it in the chat box. And here's our last question. What does the Arctic Fulbright team anticipate as the final project of the Fulbright exchange? Over to you, Mike and Ross.
So I think the gist of that is that what the end product is for the entire program. And so I will tell you that when we began the Fulbright Arctic Initiative 1, although we had a thought about what that might look like, we really wanted to have that first meeting, as Ross pointed out, in Iqaluit, to not only meet each other, but to also inform the themes that we put out there: water, infrastructure, health, etc. From there, with the team, we composed what the program would look like going forward. And that came out of a very iterative process, with the idea that the third meeting, the culminating meeting, which Fulbright 2 will have, would be the place in which we report out what it is that we were going to do. The week that we did in October in Washington, D.C. was not thought about in Iqaluit 18 months before. Some culminating event was, but the idea of a full week at Smithsonian and national academies and the State Department. That simply wasn't there. We knew we would do something. We were more focused on what the scholars brought to the table, what their individual research proposal was, enable that research to continue, and then thinking through almost individual scholarship together in a setting, and then how the groups could interact together. From the rest of the, even though we had the guardrails for it, ultimately, as it became more and more apparent where this was all going, ultimately, that culminating week came into clearer vision. But what you heard from the scholars was their products really were the takeaways for the entire program times 17. And then also Ross and I weaving together all of those, looking at the individual and then the group and then the culminating, all 17 scholars together looking at all of their work. So the final project will be individual scholarship, team scholarship, and that'll be woven like we did in that week in October. Something to add there?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Mike, and that's the sort of the end of the program. That's what we want to be able to show, and that's some of the early impact. But again, you can see that the impact of the first round is still evolving and moving, and new projects and new grants and new collaborations. And I think one of the things I hope to see as an outcome of this is, Fulbright's become more interested, I think, because of this project and thinking about collaborative teamwork and multilateral exchange. And I think the success of this program, I hope it gets picked up by other funders and other groups that are engaged in the Arctic and looking at human-environment relationships and the knowledge to power kind of approach to solving real problems. So I think it's an opportunity for Fulbright and Arctic to be leaders in the development of this collaborative model. And so I think the round 2 scholars are going to make very significant progress in sharing this approach very broadly. And I think our influence will be extended through time because of this very basic approach that we're developing.
Well, thank you. Those are great parting words, Ross. So I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank everyone for their participation, in particular our 2 lead scholars and the 3 other scholars that joined us. Thank you everyone for the good presentations, good information, sharing of your experiences, and all of the hopeful wishes for the next round to come. And thank you to our colleagues here at State Department who've put forward in the chat box and online a lot of the different resources that everyone is free to access, either looking at products that have come out of round 1 or looking for applications for round 2. We encourage you to check those out if you're interested in applying, or if you may know people in your network who are interested in applying for round 2. I think that's all.